if you watch the Olympics, you know, and you see human beings can do things that no other animal could even think of doing. I mean, we're completely crazy when it comes to the sorts of things we can do with our body. Like, we're good on ice, we're good in the water, we can ski, people are really good at jumping, they can climb across buildings. Like, people who train themselves can climb like mad. I mean, human beings are unbelievably variable in terms of their motor output. So that's another part of our intelligence that's not just abstract. And so, in part, that's because we have this very well-developed cortical area that enables us to chain ever more complex patterns of behavior together, and also to develop patterns of behavior that are sort of outside instinctual specification. So you imagine with an animal that has a less complex brain, a lot of its behavior is going to be limited to those quasi-instinctual patterns of behavior that are devoted directly towards the solution of basic biological problems. But, you know, we can kind of solve those without too much effort, and then we have all this spare motor capacity left over, and people do the weirdest things with it. You know, and really remarkable, absolutely remarkable things. So that's pretty cool. We're pretty cool that way. We don't get enough credit for it, I don't think, because human beings, if you think about a human being as an animal, which, you know, people are kind of loath to do, we are definitely the most interesting animal. I mean, if you saw like a pygmy hippopotamus skateboarding, you'd think that was pretty remarkable, you know, but people, they do those sorts of things all the time, and, you know, we just take it as a matter of course. The lowest somatomotor neuron pools, the lowest level of the locomotor system, its locomotion and action, is formed by a subset of motoneuron tools. That's wrong. Motoneurons in the spinal cord ventral horn that innervates the limb muscles responsible for locomotor behavior. I dictated this with Dragon Dictate, and now and then it does weird things, eh? So tools, God only knows where that came from. So, a set of motor neurons in the spinal cord ventral horn, so it's way down in the spine, that innervate the limb muscles responsible for locomotor behavior. When you start to think about the brain as something that moves your body, it's a lot easier to conceptualize the brain as something that's distributed through the body, you know, and your spine is actually quite smart. So even though in some sense you don't think with it, it's capable of very complex sensory detection and also motor mapping, and so mostly relatively automated and relatively reflexive. One level up, the existence of a spinal locomotor pattern generator. So this shows that the spine isn't responsible just for the most basic of motor outputs or sensory inputs. It can actually generate patterns, is demonstrated by the fact that whereas a spinal animal displays no spontaneous locomotor activity. So if you sever an animal, its nervous system, so it only has a spine, it'll just lay there. You know, you'd think it's paralyzed, that's what you would think. But coordinated limb movements characteristic of locomotion may be elicited when the limbs of such an animal are placed on a moving treadmill, thus providing somatic sensory input to the pattern generator. And so they've done this with people who are paraplegic. If you take someone who's paraplegic, and so they can't obviously walk, and you hoist them up, and you put them on a treadmill, and you lean them forward, their legs will walk. And that's spinal controlled. So that's what you're doing with your spine, you know, because you're not thinking when you walk, or you're not thinking about walking unless, you know, unless you're one of those people who can't chew gum and walk at the same time. So anyway, so it just shows you how complex you are even at the, you know, the sort of the base levels of your intelligence hierarchy. Level up, locomotor pattern controller. So it's controlling the locomotor pattern generator. In contrast, undisturbed chronic hypothalamic animals. Okay, so now one of the ways people figured out how the brain works was by sectioning animals' nervous systems when they're alive at different levels of complexity. So a spinal animal is one that's basically paralyzed. Its brain is separated from its spinal cord. But then you can separate the hypothalamus with the intact spinal cord, so it's one unit, from the cortex, and even from the memory systems, and even from most of the emotion systems. And so the animal in some sense hardly has a brain at all. You know, I mean, the hypothalamus, as you saw, it's a little tiny thing, and everything that's on top of that can be separated from it, and the animal can still act spontaneously. So So here's an example. If this has been done with cats, and if you have a female cat and it's in a cage and it's only a hypothalamic animal, it can basically manage. Like, it can't learn new things very well, and it can't remember anything. Like, it doesn't have episodic memory. And so, but it can maintain its temperature, it can eat, it can engage in sexual activity, it's got defensive aggression. Like, most of the animal in some sense is still there from an input-output perspective. It's also hyper-exploratory, which is quite interesting, eh? Because you wouldn't think, well, animal with no brain is the most exploratory kind of animal. Well, it happens to be the case as long as it has a hypothalamus. So that shows you, A, how old exploration is, but it also kind of gives you some clue about what the rest of the brain is doing. I mean, you explored new things, we'll say. So what that means is you have to be able to tell the difference between what's new and what isn't. And so what you need to tell the difference between what's new and what isn't is memory. And so a lot of what the higher order parts of the brain are doing is basically keeping track of where you've been. And so if you've been somewhere before, then the exploratory circuit is basically shut off as long as everything that you're doing there is working. And you need the whole brain basically to shut off the hypothalamus in some sense. That's how the thing works. It's like you're kind of a default on system. You know, your motor systems are ready to go, and you're alive and you're ready to go like a wild animal, but the cortex dampens that down, and it does that by only allowing the activities that are relevant to that area, and that might be none of them, to function at any one time. So you take off the cortex, well, the animal can still do a lot of things, but you know, its ability to match its behavior to novel situations and to learn new behaviors is very, very limited. So it becomes hyper-exploratory, but it can't remember anything, and it becomes very limited in the flexibility of its behavior. And so as you move farther up the hierarchy of complexity, then you're able to do more and more novel and more complex and more situation-specific things. So, in the sense of providing a certain level of endogenous activity, which means self-generated activity, so the hypothalamic animal will move by itself without being stimulated, the hypothalamic locomotor region can be thought of as a locomotor pattern controller, which generates spontaneous inputs ultimately to the spinal locomotor pattern generator. So there's hierarchy. I already talked about behavioral state inputs. There's another picture of the nervous system just to remind you of how it looks, how it's distributed through the body. Oh, this is very interesting too. I didn't learn this till I read this paper by Swanson. I thought, that's so dumb. How could I have not learned that like 30 years ago? Swanson said that, let's go back one, did I? Yeah. Raymond Cahill was like the world's greatest neuroanatomist. He was the guy who really established the field. So did a tremendous amount of investigation into the fine structure of the brain. Like 110 years ago, a long time ago. And he pointed out that sensory systems have a dual projection within the central nervous system. I told you guys about blindsight already, you know, and the fact that your eyes map onto different levels of the hierarchy, say, of sensory input and motor control. Cahill basically outlined the circuitry for that. One branch goes directly to the motor system, so that's for eye to output mapping, so that's fast because there's not a lot of thinking in between. And you might think that's bad because you want to think, but it's good because sometimes you know what to do and you don't want to think, you just want to execute it as fast as you possibly can. So these lower order, simpler inputs are good for that sort of thing. One goes directly to the motor system and the other goes more or less directly to the cerebral cortex, where sensations and perceptions are elaborated and voluntary motor impulses are generated. So this sort of explains, for a long time, experimental psychology was dominated by behaviorists who thought of the animal as a stimulus response machine and never paid much attention to the function of things like thought or emotion or complex internal states. And you know, the behaviorists got an awful long way with their idea of the animal as a sort of simple stimulus response machine, and that's partly because of this hierarchy that we're describing, you know, because you can treat an animal as if it's a pretty simple machine because it has all that simple machinery in it. It's just that on top of that simple machinery there's a lot more complex machinery. And so, but the simple machinery does a lot more than people generally think and can do more than people think. And so, the fact that there are these at least two projections, they branch more than that, gives you right away a sense of why the behaviors could have been right, and the cognitive psychologists could have been right, and even the psychodynamic thinkers can be right, because they're analyzing the system at different levels of hierarchical complexity and extracting out slightly different, what would you call, observations. And some of these things are, even like the simpler systems can have quite complex outputs. So one of the things that the simpler sensory motor system does is detect snakes, because primates don't like snakes. In fact, there's a woman named Lynn Isbell wrote a nice book on primate vision and snakes, and she was very curious about why human beings could see so well. And she also noticed that we're very good at detecting the sort of camouflage patterns that snakes use, especially in the lower half of our visual field. And she did this cross-cultural survey around the world and found out that where there's more predatory snakes, the primates have better vision. So we sort of co-evolved with snakes. And snakes gave us vision, just like it says in Genesis, which is pretty damn funny as far as I'm concerned. And it was snakes in trees even, so. And fruit, of course, gave us color vision, so the whole Genesis story nailed it pretty well. But, you know, snakes have been around long enough and have been our enemy, or say predatory reptiles, you know, if you don't really want to go with the whole snake thing, that we've evolved, we've co-evolved with them. It's like 60 million years. It's a very, very long period of time. So Darwin used to amuse himself in a Darwinian way. He'd go to there was a zoo or a place that shows reptiles. I don't remember what they're called, but they had one glass cage where there was some kind of poisonous snake. I think it was a cobra, and Darwin would put his face right up against the glass, and the cobra would go whack, and he'd jump back. And he did that many times because he was curious about whether or not he could actually bring the snake avoidance reflex under conscious control, and he couldn't. Every time the snake jumped, he'd jump backwards. He couldn't control it. And so that's because all the primates that could control it, when there were snakes biting them, are dead. So Darwin was the beneficiary of the Darwinian process in that sense. So the point is, your body's conserved all these low-level, fast operating circuits. And so you're a simple machine and a sort of complex machine and an extremely complex machine, and then something that's so complex that you can't even think about it as a machine. And you're all those things at the same time. And there's Swanson's take on how the motor system and the hypothalamus are integrated. So it's quite nice. He shows that the hypothalamic controller, so that's one of the circuits that we've been talking about that are responsible for a basic motivated state, gets sensory input, behavioral state input, that's about the body, and input from the cerebral hemispheres. Hypothetically, that's thought or voluntary action, plan, something like that. And then it has output to the motor pattern initiator, the generators, and the motor neuron pools, and then you act. Lovely. It's a beautiful, beautiful model. And so you can see that it maps very nicely onto that, with the sort of higher order levels of the hierarchy of sensory motor framing associated with cognitive abstractions, and the lowest levels associated with the sorts of things that you do with your spine. And this, I flipped this upside down here because I've been very interested in how people get traumatized, and it's easier to think of trauma when you flip the thing, because once you develop the higher order abstractions cortically, you know, you say, well, I'm a good person, let's say, then that's sort of, the fact that you're a good person, or what constitutes good, starts to become a box, the box, within which all the things that are associated with it are put. It's one of the dangers of abstraction, right, and categorization, because if you couldn't think of yourself as a good or bad person, let's say you didn't have that capacity for that level of abstraction, which is like a binary abstraction, right? Good is, you know, 1, and bad is 0. So it's a really simple abstraction. And so if you do something that a good person wouldn't do, well, clearly you don't fit into the 1 category, because a good person wouldn't do that, so maybe you fit into the 0 category. And that capacity for abstraction is also precisely the sort of thing that allows human beings to undermine themselves with thought. Because once you have that capacity for abstraction, you can make these ridiculous overgeneralizations. In fact, they're really simple. I'm not a good person, I'm a horrible person. It's like that's how someone who's really depressed thinks whenever anything goes wrong. And so it's the danger, the powerful danger of abstraction is that you can make a terrible mistake in overgeneralization. This is partly because, well, let's say, I don't know, you're out with your girlfriend and you flirt with someone else. So what does that say about your character? Well, she might think that puts you in the 0 category, like now, right? You're not a good person. It's like, well, it's complicated. Is that true? Do you belong in that 0 category? She might treat you like that for a week or two. I mean, should you be taking yourself apart completely because you've made that error? Or should you seek farther down the chain of abstractions for a more specific mistake? Or should she help you do that? It's like, well, you're not a complete 0, you're more like a, 0.1. She could help you figure out exactly where in your personality hierarchy you have this fault, assuming that it's a fault. Maybe it's an indication that the relationship is over. Who knows? So, anyways, I wanted to show you that because then you can develop a sense of how this hierarchical system can also lead to cataclysmic overgeneralization. And that's associated with lots of different mental illnesses, especially depression. Because depressed people generally go from a small mistake, well, a mistake, hard to parameterize, right to the highest level of abstraction. Say, well, I've made error A, therefore I'm useless, or therefore I'm bad. It's not good. It's too undifferentiated. I put that in there to remind you that all these little things are informed by the underlying hypothalamic circuits. So, that whole hierarchy has to be, imagine how it's conditioned, that whole hierarchy of motor output. Part of it is conditioned by, and then this is sort of like an output or an input system that Swanson didn't talk about. It's sort of sensory. That whole sensory motor hierarchy, sensory motor perception action hierarchy, we'll say, has to be constructed so that your basic motivational states stay satiated, right? Because otherwise you get thirsty enough and you die, or you get hungry enough and you die. It's like you have to organize your behavior so that those basic motivations stay fulfilled. So each of the little ovals that make up that hierarchy have to be organized and laid out with that set of limitations in mind. But then, of course, there's a higher order limitation, which is more the one that Piaget talked about, which is that not only do you have to organize your internal hierarchies to take care of all of your basic motivations, but you have to do that while everyone else is doing the same thing. And so in some sense, the hypothalamic system that's generating the impetus for these layers and layers of motor output also has to do so in a social context. Because otherwise, you fight to the death over a stick of bread, which seems like a very counterproductive thing to do.